Mondale.
That lasted 6 months. And when we got totally crushed in the general election, I got a call from the New Republic, and they said, "We think you're unemployed now. Would you like to come and work for us?" I said yes right away and started. On the day Reagan was sworn in, that's the first day I started at the New Republic as a writer.
So help me God.
The new president was promising big changes, even starting the world anew. Reagan's inaugural truly signaled a great clash of ideas.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
And the New Republic was right in the midst of it.
Well, it was overwhelmingly liberal. The writers were the best of that era. I was still a Democrat at the time, a traditional liberal Democrat, a great society liberal, but I was pretty hardline on the Soviets. It's hard for people to believe now, but the Democratic Party had a very powerful wing that was very anti-Soviet.
But those Democrats were a dying breed, and Krauthammer found himself agreeing more with President Reagan than with his liberal readers.
I ended up supporting just about every element of the Reagan foreign policy, and boy, did we get reaction from our liberal readership. I wrote one editorial excoriating the nuclear freeze that caused the largest number of canceled subscriptions in the history of the magazine, which I was very proud of.
What was his writing like?
It's always been extremely step-by-step logical. If you can read a column by Charles about something and you can still disagree with him after you're through with it, then you know you must have a pretty good argument.
Those arguments had conservative columnists like William F. Buckley wondering why Krauthammer and the New Republic were not supporting Reagan's re-election in 1984.
What Buckley was writing was, why don't you give up on the Democrats? And I was still one of those who wanted to sort of save the soul of the Democratic Party and maintain this conservative element of which the magazine really was.
Krauthammer fired off a letter to Buckley, writing, Reagan still had, quote, a lot to answer for on foreign policy, and his domestic policy was far worse. Quote, the catalog of sins we believe the president has committed is too long to recapitulate here. But Krauthammer tells me he privately wanted Reagan to beat his old boss, Walter Mondale.
But I had worked for Mondale in 1980. I liked him and had respect for him. And as a personal matter, as a kind of a matter of honor, I didn't want to vote against a man for whom I had respect and affection.
So you have a vote, Reagan or Mondale?
That's the only presidential election where I left that line blank.
Left it blank.
But if I had been the swing vote, I would have obviously have voted for Reagan.
It was a turning point in Krauthammer's transition from the political left to the political right.
And just a few months after the election, I wrote something called the Reagan Doctrine.
It was a Time magazine column, and it was provocative. For while Krauthammer had praised Reagan on a number of foreign policy issues, he was now crediting him with a breakthrough insight that changed the calculus of the Cold War.
I realized that what Reagan had done without a grand master plan was to challenge what at the time was called the Brezhnev Doctrine. And that was whenever we take over a country, it becomes a communist, it's ours. And all of a sudden what Reagan had done is to challenge that and to say, no, you don't get to keep what you got. We're going to challenge your possessions, wherever they are. And I thought, this is a really good idea. And I'm going to give it a name.
He invented the Reagan Doctrine, not Reagan. And now everybody's got to have a doctrine.
Yeah.
Charles has made it mandatory to come up with a doctrine for every president.
But even after Reagan's 49-state landslide, Krauthammer was still not sure what to make of Reagan the man, who he met at the White House in 1986.
He invited me to lunch. I tried to engage him, like on the Contras, what are you going to do? And all of a sudden, what I'm hearing from him is a story about how when he and Nancy were in the guest house of President Marcos of the Philippines, there was a giant spider on the ceiling, and the question was how to get him off without scaring Nancy. And I'm thinking, I don't get it. This is the most successful president in my lifetime. He seems to be out to lunch. What's going on?
He says it was only later that he realized what eluded him about Reagan.
He had no need ever to show how smart he was. He knew exactly what I was asking. He didn't want to talk about it. And if you thought he was a dunce, he didn't care, because he knew that he wasn't.
It would also be some time before Krauthammer embraced a conservative domestic policy, taxes, welfare, small government, and other Reagan-esque sins.
It took me about a decade. I was skeptical of tax cuts. I was skeptical of smaller government at the beginning. And then by the end of the 80s, I had begun to change.
What happened?
Empirical evidence. As a doctor, I'd been trained in empirical evidence. I mean, if the treatment is killing your patients, you stop the treatment. And I began to look and to read and to think about whether the view I had of a social democratic society like they had in Europe was the right way. And I sort of, I moved gradually to the idea of a more limited society, smaller government.
By that time, Krauthammer's world was really falling into place. In 1985, his son, Daniel, was born. 2 years later, Krauthammer won the biggest honor in print journalism, the Pulitzer Prize. Not bad for someone who started in the business less than a decade earlier, without even a writing sample. He went straight from the ceremony to see his father, who'd once worried about his son's jump from medicine to journalism. Shulam Krauthammer was 84 and gravely ill.
I went to the hospital where he was, and I said, "Dad, I have something I want to give you." And I gave him the medal. And he beamed, and he showed it to all the nurses.
It turned out to be Krauthammer's final visit with his dad.
So the last time I saw him was a time when this whole circle was closed, and he could feel that the choice had been redeemed in some way. It was a very comforting thing to remember about the last time you see your parent.
Krauthammer called the 1990s a holiday from history. The Cold War was won. The era of big government declared over. And 9/11 brought a new urgency to his commentary.
People understand there is a nexus between these weapons, these states, and the terrorists, and we have to attack them where they are.
Krauthammer began appearing on Special Report's All-Star panel and was soon an audience favorite.
You've been a fixture on Special Report for a long time, and even still, a lot of people don't know that you're in a wheelchair. They don't know the extent of your paralysis.
I am sitting behind a table. And it is true. I'd say half the people I meet are absolutely surprised to see me in a wheelchair. And one of the more amusing of those incidents happened about 8, 9 years ago. And I remember I was sitting in Madison Square Garden in the Fox box. I think it was a convention. And then Sean Hannity stands up and walks up the stairs. He looks at me and he goes, "What happened?" I just, I told him I was hurt as a medical student. It was no big deal. But it just told me that even somebody I'd been on the air with wouldn't know.
What is apparent is that Krauthammer has the attention of people in high places. Just one example, Krauthammer's opposition to White House counsel Harriet Miers not only helped block her nomination to the Supreme Court, a comment on the panel apparently gave President Bush a way out.
I remember thinking, how do they get out of this? And it came to me while on the set of Special Report. I think what the administration ought to do is to say, look.
His face-saving solution basically went like this. Because Miers' legal writings were covered by executive privilege, the Senate couldn't vet her, so she had to withdraw.
And 3 days later, that's what they did.
Are you surprised by the amount of influence that you have with your column, with Special Report, that you hear or see things that happen as a result of a column or a statement? Do you ever think about it?
No, I think about it, and I find it worrisome. The reason is that when I was totally unknown, I could say anything I damn well pleased.
Coming up, power players and power hitters. From the All-Star panel to the ballpark in 8 minutes flat.